Hello, everybody, and welcome to next session of our Piwik PRO Day. This time, this will be a discussion. We will be considering the topic of privacy and marketing and how to make those both, let's call it, worlds to work together and for the benefit of the organizations, because as we all know, this can be sometimes very, very challenging. Today with me is two exceptional experts that I think will handle the toughest of the questions with flawlessly. So Lisette, the DPO of Piwik PRO. Hi, Lisette.
Hello.
And Brian Clifton from Search Integration.
Hi.
Yes, so I think we've got quite a lot of ground to cover today and not much time. So enough of the introductions, and let's dive into the first topic. So let's start with, let's say, painting a general picture here. So responsibilities and obligations. So let's try to define what are the in the privacy space, what are the obligations that should be associated with marketing teams, and what would be the responsibilities of the legal / privacy team. Lisette, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I like the way you introduced it. We feel like we have two different worlds. We have the marketing world and the legal or compliant world. And we see that in practice, sometimes it seems a bit hard to get them to communicate in the right way, or we feel as a marketer, maybe we can skip the legal part because they give us a pretty hard time and we just want to do something good for the company and have the opportunities in the legal department might stop us. I think we can do a lot on this field, but I know it's difficult because we do speak a little bit of a different language. But I think if you keep the obligation of both departments in mind, it makes it easier. So for example, if you feel like you want to do something new as a marketing team, or maybe you want to use new technologies on the website, it's really important to make sure that the legal department is part of this idea from the beginning, because if you have to, speaking from a legal perspective, if you have to review something when it's at the end and all the decisions are already made, if you say, well, maybe this has to be changed, or maybe we have to do something different, it takes more time. Usually it costs more money. And it's exactly the thing that makes the legal department the black sheep, because you say no again. But if you're part of it from the start, you can think about it together. So what goal do we want to reach? How can we do it? What kind of data do we need? So as a marketing department, you also have to think about these questions. What kind of data will be part of this opportunity? So you give the legal department all the assets they need to review it. And another very important part, I think, is that especially if you look at, for example, tracking technologies, the use of cookies and other technologies, it is so important that it's not a one-time review. So we feel like, okay, well, we passed the legal department, we got a go, it's all good. And then maybe in a month or 2 months, we decide to use a different tool that might be just a little bit different than we did before. Make sure the departments keep talking together. So it's not a one-time review, but actually it's like a continuously review. So I think these are two things that are very important to make it easier for ourselves, and also to keep both departments part of all the opportunities and ideas we have, because we do have a main goal in the end, and that's the business, the opportunities we have. We both have the same goal.
Okay, thank you, Lisette. Brian, what would be your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's super important to have these teams talking to each other. I'd certainly widen it beyond marketing and legal. I would say bring IT in there as well and make it very much a collaboration. I know it's very easy to say, but really marketers and people involved in data collection really are scared of going to the legal department, because they kind of know what the answer is going to be, which is no, and they can't live with no data. And often a marketing team or even a data team or even the IT team can't can't fully explain the importance of the data, what they're going to do with it, how it's used, not just by the organization, but by third parties that may be receiving the data as well. So you often collect data in order to optimize advertising or remarketing. And often there's a language barrier. You know, we do all speak different languages. There is a language barrier of how to communicate how that data is going to be used and how privacy can be respected and how business risk can be managed. So I'd echo what Lisette was saying is, you know, bring these teams together early days. Don't wait till the end and then try and sprinkle some legal magic at the end and expect it to work. And this reminds me very much, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the battles between marketing and IT, you know, 20 years ago, when you know, marketing didn't understand what IT needed more time, needed more planning in order to launch something, and IT didn't understand the marketing pressures of launching a product and having to do it at a deadline. And if you miss the boat, then there's, you know, there's an awful lot of money wasted. So those battles took probably the best part of 10 years to overcome. So that, you know, marketing and IT, I would hopefully say nowadays work quite smoothly. And we're kind of having that same battle now with a new team that's coming in, which is compliance or legal. So yeah, work together, work collaboratively, and don't wait till the end to get some legal advice. And it doesn't always have to be a legal person. It could be an intermediary. You know, a data protection officer often isn't a legal expert, but they're there to protect the privacy interests of end users. So try and find an intermediary person that can bring it all together and help, you know, the communication of some of these. Some are quite technical and some are quite legal aspects. So a bridge, if you like.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So let's maybe try to give some tips on how to organize this. So how, in your opinion, a meeting between, let's say, the first meeting, let's call it like this, between the marketing team and the compliance legal team should look like? What would be, in your opinion, the best agenda, for example?
Is that to me?
Whoever wants to start, please start.
I'll kick off then. I think be prepared. If you're a marketer or an IT person and you're coming in up against legal, just be prepared. So that means understanding exactly what data you are collecting. You'd be surprised that, you know, when I often speak to teams and I say, okay, what is it you're collecting? You know, assume you have consent from the visitor. What is the landscape? What are all of these pixels that are firing, and what are the cookies that are being set? Often the answer is they don't know. So coming to the table with some idea of what you actually have loading on your website or in your app, what tools are involved, whether it's Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or somebody else, and how that data is stored and processed. Now, you don't have to know all of the details. Of course, that's a process that you work through, but at least come to the table knowing what you expect if a visitor comes to your website, what happens if they give you consent. And often you'd be surprised how many people just don't know that.
Okay,
audit your website. Do some auditing. That's the first thing.
Yeah, beautiful advice. Lisette, what would you like to add here?
I totally agree with what Brian says. What I personally really like is, for example, I understand that marketing has to be prepared. So know what do you want and what kind of data do you need for it. But I also understand as a lawyer that the marketing team might not know all the answer or all the questions the legal department wants to ask. So what I really like is, as a for example, as a company, you work with a standard checklist that maybe might be filled in by marketing before the meeting starts. So is it a tool from a third party? Do we know where the third party is located? Do we know what kind of data is collected? Do we maybe already have the data? And if so, when did we collect it? And did we get consent in any way? Did we document that we got consent? So if you have all these questions made up maybe together with the legal and marketing department, or maybe only by the legal department, then the marketing department knows what to expect and how to prepare. So what you often see is that you have the first meeting, and then exactly what Brian says, legal will fire all these questions, and then the marketing department will feel like, well, we just have a good idea and we just want to know if we can continue, yes or no. It might help if you know what kind of questions you have to answer before this first meeting to be prepared on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Lisette, thank you. Great advice, guys. Let's move to the next topic. So now let's call it tale as old as time. So consent banners and the opt-in rate. So let's maybe start with Brian providing some more context to this very convoluted topic. Brian, the floor is yours.
Well, I come to this as a data practitioner, obviously, but very much, a privacy advocate and privacy expert these days. So, I try to take that middle ground. We, as a business, you just cannot survive in the 21st century without collecting data. That just has to be a given. And so the idea of having no data, that just doesn't work. It doesn't compute. But these consent banners are a real pain for everybody. Privacy advocates, I'm sure Lisette is the same. We all hate them because they're done on a per site website. And we seem to have got ourselves as an industry into a real mess about arguing, if you look at the next slide, about whether the button is, green or black or blue. I mean, some of the arguments that are being had there, legal arguments as well, and some of the judgments I personally think are quite ridiculous. I can't believe how we've ended up with all of the big issues of the day and the dangers and harms that are happening with fake news and social media abuse and things like that, that we're having these discussions at a legal level. So I am kind of disappointed in where we are. But the reason is, if you just go to the next slide, there are some very powerful reasons why we have to have consent banner. And it is that a lot of people don't want to be tracked. They don't want to be surveilled. They don't want to be tracked online and marketed to and targeted. So this is some data. It's kind of a proxy of people not wanting to be tracked. And it's how many people, it's US based, how many people install ad blocking software. And yes, obviously the main reason is to block ads, but the second reason when you ask people that use ad blockers is to protect their privacy. So you can see here is 1 in 3 in America. And if we just look at the European situation, so this is really good data from the EU data authorities, where they show that people who are trying to make a decision, they're trying to change whether cookies are being saved, so either delete them, changing some of the settings in the browser, or maybe even using an ad blocker. Whatever it is, how many people are doing this across Europe? And you can see, they're pretty high numbers. Germany, well, it's a little bit low, I would suggest, because Germany is historically known to be a very private, sensitive nation, but they're 48%. Finland seems to be extremely sensitive with 75%. But I think the point is these are high numbers. So this is 1 in 2. It's 50% is the average number across the board. So there's a large number of people that don't want to be tracked, and we have to respect that. So the consent banner is the device to do that. I'm really against it. I wish we could get the tech companies to, have a setting within the browser, so it's kind of set and forget. But of course, if we do that, then most people, like this 50% number here, a one-time setting, you can imagine how fearful people like Google, etc., are of having a one setting, that catch-all setting. So they don't want to do it because they want to constantly hope that people will consider again and opt in. So we're in this messy situation, but it's really important to get this right. And I think if you have a consent banner, I'm not going to argue about the green or the black. I just think that's silly. But the most important thing I see with consent banners is they're not actually configured correctly. They don't work. So if, for example, you say reject all, what you often find is there are pixels firing, even though I said no. And there are cookies being set that shouldn't be set, even though I said no. So this is one of the pain areas here. There's a question mark on whether that collection of data is being done deliberately or by mistake. I suspect it's by mistake, because the conversations that we just talked about earlier that should be happening with IT and marketing and IT, marketing and legal often don't. Well, they happen, but if they do happen, often when people walk out of the room, that's the end of the conversation, and the joining of the dots doesn't happen. So I suspect these banners failing is a kind of mistake, but nonetheless, there is, making a mistake or ignorance is no excuse in law. So you do have to get on top of this and check that your banner does what it says it does.
Okay, thank you, Brian. This was a very broad picture you've presented here, not very encouraging for organizations, let's call it like this. Okay, so Lisette, what would you like to add here?
Well, I agree. It's a hard topic because I think we all know we're pretty fed up with all the cookie banners or the consent banners. Sorry. So we see these rates for people rejecting, and I think with the consent banner, it's pretty hard to even know, are we really giving consent, or do we just want access to the website, or just get rid of the consent banner? So I think that's the first the hard part of the topic. So we're totally fed up with it. Are we really getting the consent in the way we want to? And then the point that Brian also says is that we maybe find a nice way to design the consent banner. We have the right text in it. We have a accept and maybe reject button. But then how it's implemented, then legal leaves. And for example, like Brian says, maybe if you say reject all, still cookies or pixels are fired. But what we also see is that we have the banner and it's not implemented in such a way that the cookies and pixels are fired sometimes even before we give consent. So it's like weighing two things. You have to maybe the legal part correct, but then it's the technical part that's also hard, also with some specific technologies. And the hardest part, I think, because there are so many things going through my mind when we talk about this topic, is that we have a specific law that tells us you need to get consent, and consent has to be active, it has to be explicit. We know all these things, but how you do it in practice is up to you. So we're talking about the colors. We have discussion about, do we need an accept and reject all button? Can we check boxes? And the hard part also is that a lot of websites are not only focusing on one European country. So we might have a website that's international. But what we also see is that all these supervisory authorities in all these different countries have their own opinions about how to do things. And we saw it in the beginning that it was said we didn't need to get consent if cookies were only purely analytical. And we saw it with Google Analytics that your privacy was better off with some specific settings. It's so hard for a company to have one consent banner that has a fits all way, that I think this is a discussion that I wish I would be able to say, if you do it this way, you're all good. But I know that that's not the case. It actually, and I hate the answer, depends on what you're doing and who and where are you focusing on, and what kind of technologies are you using. And again, with the topic we talked about before, keep in mind that if you change some things on your website, you might also have to change the consent banner. And also, if the technologies are different, you have to get consent again. And it's a never-ending topic.
I think it's not. I just want to pick up the point that I don't think it's doom and gloom. There's an awful lot of data out there. Too much, often people would say. Most of it's not even used, that's collected. And most of it's just noise or junk or spam or something like that. So even though consent rates are 50%, and they are dropping because it's such a toxic, poisoned pond at the moment in terms of data collection being sucked up and how it's used, that's a bigger subject. But on individual websites, company websites, 50% opt-in rate is still an awful lot of data. You can still do some great stuff with that in terms of optimizing your website and optimizing your marketing. So it's kind of doom and gloom that we've ended up in this, but still there's plenty of data there to really do some good stuff on. And I think that the key thing with consent is don't treat it as a battle of gaining compliance or not, or making sure that one lawyer particularly likes your design or not. I think you have to be a lot more pragmatic. I think what Lisette is saying is there is a lot of choice here in terms of banner design. It's not quite as rigorous as black and white as people think. And the key thing here is for an organization to take this opportunity. You only get a few seconds and yeah, most people just want to get rid of it. But the key thing is build that trust. The reason why 50% of people opt out is because they don't trust you. They don't trust what's happening with the data. So the only way to change that is to build that trust, not find a sneaky way around of how can I gain consent without the user really knowing what they're doing, but actually build the trust so it's completely transparent. And they think, you know what, you're a strong brand. I believe your values, your ethics or whatever, therefore I will give you some data to optimize the experience. So all of this comes down to trust. I just hate the idea that this is a tick box exercise that you just have to get through just because there's a law. Think of it much more positive in terms of trust building. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a customer for a company that they trust?
I actually really like this point of view that you have, because, and that's something I always keep saying, that it's not just about being compliant. You can also use it, and that's more from a commercial view, but being compliant and privacy is also a unique selling point for your organization. If people trust you and they feel like they want to give or they want to say yes in the consent banner, then actually what you're doing with the data later on, so for example, making sure showing the right content to visitors, I feel it's way more valuable if people give more of an active, or maybe they think about it more before they will actually give you consent. I think it's way more valuable if that's the case than if you just think we have a consent banner, okay, we're compliant and let's go, because you want the data to be valuable as well, and you want to have to actually reach the purpose you have from a marketing perspective. And I feel like if you have the trust, and if you, instead of thinking only, okay, well, we need to tick the checkbox and we need to be compliant just because we have to and it's a law, if you look at it from another perspective, so what can we do to build this trust and actually use privacy as a USP for ourselves, I think you can reach way more with that attitude than
it's an asset. I mean, the whole thing is an asset, a business asset. I really do think that.
If I can add one short thing from a legal perspective, I think it's really important if you can show that you actually had some active thoughts about how you want to do it. So you can tell and you document why you made certain decisions. From a legal perspective, I think that's way better than just copy pasting some text and putting it in a consent banner. Also, if you have a check from the supervisory authority, that will always be my legal advice. Make sure that you think about why you do it and document it and why you made certain choices. You will win the legal battle way faster that way.
Okay, thank you, Lisette. Let's move on. So next topic, anonymous data. So probably so many organizations sleep well at night because they think that the data of their customers is safe and secured because it is anonymized. But as we know, the situation is not that black and white, and it's a bit more complex. So our next task here is to debunk this a bit. So Lisette, please start.
Yeah, it's also a really nice topic, because we feel like when we feel like we work with anonymous data pretty quickly, while in practice to have anonymous data is pretty hard. So from a legal perspective, anonymous data means that you can't identify, or a person is not identifiable. So what I see a lot is that if a company, for example, hashes data, or so they use an encryption technology, they feel like, well, there's no name or just random numbers, I can't identify a person, so I work with anonymous data. And it's really important to keep in mind that that's not the case. And the Federal Trade Commission wrote a pretty interesting blog about this recently. And what I most of the time say, when something is repeatable, for example, with hashing data, if you hash the same data over and over, you will get the same result. Of course, you can use assault and other technical things you can do. But if that's the case, so when it's repeatable, we say anonymization or using hashing is more a security measure than it is a form of anonymization, because the person is still identifiable. You can single out maybe not a person, but someone, even if you don't know who that person is, from the data. And that makes it really hard, because we feel if we look at the data and we're not able to identify with our own eyes or with our human brain, we feel like, oh, we're all good and we have the data anonymized and we don't need consent for it because it's not identifiable. But when someone visits the website again, you have so much data about it and collected to, or actually stuck to the hashed, for example, IP address or whatever you use. We can't call it anonymization anymore. So we really have to keep in mind that having anonymous data really is a challenge, and it's not that easy that just using encryption is the way forward and keeps you away from the consent banner. So keep in mind that most of the times that is only a security measure, and we will call it a pseudonym. I'm really stuck on the word, so I'm just skipping it for now, but it's a security measure. And that's really important to keep in mind, because if you think it's anonymous and work in that way so you don't get consent, then you will have a legal issue.
Okay, thank you, Lisette. Brian, what would you like to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I use the jigsaw slide issue. You have that. I think that the challenge is data today is collected in an individual way. So every individual is tracked. It's not aggregate anymore. Used to be. It used to be all aggregate data. So you knew 1,000 visitors came from Google and 50 of them clicked on an ad and 5 of them converted. But that's all you knew. It was just a number. But now there's an individual ID. And as Lisette was saying there, you know, if you hash it or encrypt it in some way, you're just creating a super individual ID, but it's still a unique ID. In fact, it's very, very unique ID. So unique that it's very hard to get rid of. And the challenge with that is if there's a unique ID that's being passed around the world, wherever somebody else sees that unique ID, they can possibly match it. So Google, for example, can match a unique anywhere it sees it, whether it's on its own properties or some other website. It sees this unique ID it's created, and it can just match the hashes. So the fact that the hash means nothing to anybody is, like Lisette was saying, it's a security measure. But when you can add other data to it, then you get this jigsaw effect where actually it's quite easy to find out that, I don't know, an analytics expert based in Sweden who speaks English and has written books, you're pretty much going to find me in the top 10 results on Google, for example. That means you've taken some pseudo-anonymous identification or information, the fact that I'm a man, the fact that I live in Sweden, the fact that I'm English, my expertise. You take these like anonymous data points, what type of car I drive. I drive a Lexus, so what? There's probably millions of people driving Lexus. But you stitch those many points together, and it's not long before a company like a Google or a Microsoft can actually find out, yeah, it's Brian Clifton or it's Lisette or it's Martin. So it's much, much better not to collect individualized data in the first place. Track it at an aggregate level rather than this super, hyper kind of surveillance economy that we've ended up in.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Lisette, would you like to add something here, or we're good?
No, I agree with all the points, and I feel like we still have the idea that if we use specific technologies, the data is anonymous. And what's maybe also good to say that from a legal perspective, if you're not able to identify a person or make someone identifiable, which means they don't even have to be identified yet, that doesn't mean that the data is anonymous. So if another company can do it easily, for example, like Brian said, at Google, that still can mean that the data is not anonymous. So it's not, it doesn't have to be that you're not able to. If someone else is able to with the data, it still can be identifiable data, so personal data. So you also have to keep in mind that it's not the question, am I not able to identify someone, but also what if this data set ends up over there? What can they do with it? And if they can single out the person, well, keep in mind that anonymous is such a hard thing to reach if you use it to single out persons.
You got to remember, I mean, if somebody fills in a form on your website and they give you their data, I mean, that's fine. Obviously, you still have, there's still privacy protection, there's still security and encryption and all of those things you have to consider. But if somebody freely and knowingly gives you information by filling in a form, it's fine to be able to identify that visitor. If I make an inquiry about booking a holiday, you need to know who I am. If I've paid, if I've made a transaction, you need to know that it's a real transaction. I'm a real person. So collecting information in itself about individuals is fine if they freely give it. What we're talking about here is this anonymous, pseudo-anonymous tracking that happens just by visiting a website. And the whole idea we've got into this trap that you have to have individual identifiers is because of remarketing. The idea that, I go to a website and then I go, thank you very much. I don't give any information. I go to another website, but I'm targeted on that other website with an ad. I mean, that's remarketing. And that's why companies like Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Facebook, they want a unique ID dropped on me because they want to be able to profile me and drop an ad wherever I am online. But that's very, very different. That remarketing and targeting and profiling is very different to optimizing your website. It's very for its marketing and very different from optimizing your website for user experience. So yes, the identification allows you to remarket and target ads when they're away, when the visitor's gone somewhere else. But if you can live without that, there's a ton of optimization you can do about your website and a ton of optimization you can do about your marketing activities. So visitors click on an ad or a campaign or whatever, SEO, and they land on your website. You still have all of that data. So it's this idea that somehow you can't do any kind of analytics unless you have a unique ID. I really want to kind of dispel that myth in this. And you say you don't need to. Remarketing is important, of course, but think about how you use that and whether you need to use it or what's the purpose of your analytics tool. Maybe you have separate tools to do remarketing and they can be governed by a separate level of consent.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And I think this smoothly transitions us to the last topic of today. So now we know that there are quite a lot of challenges when using anonymous data, but there's this other type, let's call it like this, as Brian mentioned, maybe a bit forgotten today. So aggregated data. Brian, could you start?
Well, I mean, I built my career on this. I've been around long enough. I was working in the early 2000s with Urchin Software and then obviously launching the early days of Google Analytics. It was aggregate data. And, it only really became so personalized, hyper-personalized around about 2014, 15, something like that. So, 10, 15 years I've been doing this before it all became about remarketing. So that's the problem I think we were saying. If you collect data with a unique ID, it's almost impossible to ever anonymize that. The unique ID is there somewhere, and there's some very complicated, sophisticated statistical techniques that can be employed to try and anonymize it. But ultimately, if you collect data, with consent, of course, but if you collect data that is aggregated, so those unique IDs disappear after they've been collected. So the visitor comes to your website, they have a unique ID because you need to stitch together the session, of course. But once they leave your website, if that ID disappears, that's aggregate data, that's benign. That's not going to really cause anyone any harm. And there's an argument that's been going around for several years now is, in that situation, aggregate benign data, do you even need consent? Because it's just aggregate data. And there are some authorities out there, data protection authorities, that have given guidance to say you don't need consent. The French, I think, was the first one a few years ago now, three or so years ago. But also the Spanish DPA has come out and approved this and said, yeah, we accept it. I've heard Latvia have also done this as well. And I listened to a webinar recently from the Danish DPA that said, hey, we don't have a problem with aggregate data as long as you can, show that and prove it. Still requires careful consideration. It's not a panacea, but there's an opportunity here. And you think about what we talked about earlier. 50% in Europe not wanting to consent, or at least wanting to protect their privacy, 1 in 3 in the US. If you just dial down the invasiveness of what you're actually collecting in the first place, there's a chance that you can keep all of the data because you don't need to ask for consent. Go back to what it was in the old days when data was benign and not hyper-targeted. So as you probably guess, I'm a champion of that approach.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Brian. Lisette, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree again, but what I see a lot is that we feel the need to collect as much as possible, but we're not really always able to explain why or if we actually use it. So we feel need, well, if we collect it now, we might need it later, we might use it later. So sometimes it's really good to just start and think, okay, what kind of goals do I want to reach and what do I really need for that? And I do feel that more often we feel that we do need more data, while in practice sometimes you can do a lot with less data and still reach the goals you want to reach. So maybe it's good to just sit at a table again with, for example, IT, marketing, and legal, and feel like, okay, what is it we want to do and how can we do it? Because if you don't need a consent, that's also an opportunity, of course, because if you look at the consent rates, if we do collect all the for example, the unique IDs that make it able to single out a person. So say you get 50% of the time you get consent, so you have half of the audience you can use the data from. But if you use less invasive ways and you might not need the consent, maybe you will reach your goal way earlier than you thought you would. So think about, what do I actually need, and not only from a compliance perspective, but it does help, because if you need to do less to be compliant, or I don't say that correctly, because still keep in mind that you have to make sure you use aggregated data. And if you start combining the aggregated data, for example, with identifiable data and see if you can single out anything, keep in mind that the data that you said was aggregated, keep it aggregated. So don't do other things to make it identifiable again. But if you're able to do that, I think it helps on both parts. So maybe you can reach your marketing goals earlier, but it also makes it easier from a legal perspective. I do want to say that what I do feel like is a hard part and I'm not able to fix is that the different view of perspectives in different countries on the subject make it hard for companies to feel confident enough to do it in the right way. But like I said before, if you make sure you think about the choices you make and you document how you do it and why you do it, I think that brings you a very long way. So I totally agree with what Brian says, and I think we should do way more with aggregated data than we're already doing, because there's so much more we can do, but we're just having like this tunnel vision and feel like we need to collect so much just because it's easy or it gives us more knowledge about our visitors. Well, I think we should do it actually in another way.
But I mean, when I'm working with clients, when you ask them what data you're collecting, most of them don't even realize just how much they are collecting. A lot of it I find is noise, is not used. So there's the phrase is data minimization. You know, figure out what you need in order to answer your business questions. And then as your business questions evolve and grow and you need more data, then have that conversation with IT and legal and marketing and see what data you need, and then grow the pie instead of, you know, as you were saying, Lisette, you know, have this huge kind of splurge of data and only a fraction of it is being used, because then you have huge privacy risks, huge compliance risks for your business. So much better to keep, you know, this tight control over it. I'm a bit of a control freak, so I do a lot of auditing. So, you know, have tight control over what you need and then grow the pie. Yeah, it's just safer. And at the end of the day, you'll spend, yeah, your analysts will spend less time, you know, looking at effectively noise or junk and more time looking at the valuable data. I mean, that's what you need. It's relevant traffic and valuable data.
And also one thing I want to add, because that's a very good point. Also figure out, if you use tools from third parties, what do they actually collect? Because it's exactly what you say, we don't know. Maybe we don't have a clear view on what is collected. And if we don't know, and if you just pick tools because they're cheap, maybe they're free to use, or other companies use them, so I might use them as well. Make sure you figure out what these tools actually do and what do they collect before you use them, because maybe you will come to the conclusion you don't need that, or that's not the way you want it to work. So think about that.
There is so much data duplication and triplication out there. I mean, often external agencies helping a large organization, and you know, in a multi-language, multi-market environment, there'll be multiple agencies all asking pretty much for the same thing. And the first question I like to ask is, well, do we already have this data? It may not be exactly the same shape or form that you're asking for, but it might be in the system somewhere in a slightly different way that you haven't noticed. So, you know, those kind of questions, you know, do we need it? Why do we need it? Do we already have it? And yeah, like you said, what are you going to do with it, and what's the vendor going to do with it? Because it really is more about what you as the data controller is going to do it, but there's also this element of the data processor might also be using it for their benefit, like remarketing and stuff like that.
Okay, Brian. So I think this is a very nice closing thought for this unfortunately lightning fast, but great privacy and marketing discussion. So when working with data, always be considered. Don't collect everything, collect what you need. Yes, okay, so some closing remarks. So Lisette, Brian, thank you very much for joining us today. I think the audience will find your advice quite valuable, but if anybody is still interested in asking some questions, or would like to extend or would like our expert to extend on what they said, please join our Q&A.